Good morning. My name is Glenn Morgan. I'm a host of Smooth Jazzy Grooves, a show that is aired Wednesday nights from 10 to midnight. Every Wednesday you could tune in and you can catch the kind of music I play is sort of Canadian content, Caribbean jazz, because don't think that we have enough Caribbean jazz played on radio stations in Canada and also North American. So I try to package it together and give the best show that I can. Now, this morning, we're here to discuss jazz or jazzing on the airwaves and probably how it works or would be incorporated into a mainstream thing as it should be, bringing in other genres in the jazz sort of medium as it is, because we have jazz played on certain radio stations, which is CBC, as a mainstream jazz show, but I think that we need to get other types of formats of jazz played on mainstream radio as such. And this morning we have a panel who would be quite knowledgeable about jazz and things that have happened over the years when I was not even living in Canada. I'm only here for the past, 11 years. So let me introduce the panel to you. We have Sharon McLeod, the lady on the panel. She's a jazz vocalist, a jazz programmer, and a freelance broadcaster. And for those of you who may know about her or heard her, she was at one time hosting a jazz show on Flow Radio 93.5. I guess it would be interesting to know why she isn't there anymore. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. The next gentleman on her left is Norman Otis Richmond. He's a news director and a host of the Diasporic Music, and from a different perspective on CKLM FM 88.1 radio. I have been hearing a lot of Otis for quite some time, ever since I've been here, and I've always wanted to talk with him because I understand he's quite knowledgeable about music on the whole. Well, I guess he will have some information to share with you as well. Also, we have the next gentleman is Mr. Winston Smith. He's a professor of English at Seneca College. He has hosted expandable language jazz program at CKLM for for 10 years. I couldn't understand that, sorry. And he has written on jazz and blues for journalists and academic publications. And I'm sure he too would have some good information to share with us. And last but not least, Mr. Curtis Bailey. I understand for some 15 years or so he has been a radio broadcaster on, what station is it, sir?
I was with CIUT, and now I'm doing things not on a regular basis, but sometimes I'm asked to co-host, and I've done some things for Black History Month at CKLN.
Okay.
And previous to that, I wrote a column for Contrast newspaper for good 10 to 12 years. Norman and I were at that paper for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Well, I understand that Mr. Bailey is quite informative of the situations with jazz, and if I am not mistaken, I understand that he probably might have a bit of information that those of you who know about the name, what's this gentleman's name? Charlie Parker. I think that he was at that concert. So I guess he will, well, Bird, that's his alias. So we'll sort of start off right away with Sharon McLeod, and I'd like Sharon to share with you all any information that she might have or knowledge on jazz in the airwaves. You could start just about where you want.
Well, if it wasn't for community radio, this music wouldn't really be heard in a real way. And that's, I'm speaking as a person who started off in community radio at CKLN with a show called Face the Music. I also co-hosted Dat Dare for a while, and went on to Flow to do Epistrophe, and I'm in the CBC cat and mouse game at the moment. What can I say about jazz on the airwaves? If we just look at it, if we just look at radio as an industrial tool, the way it is for hip hop, the way it is for R&B, it's not serviced the way it should be. For different reasons on community radio, where the programmer is really an independent radio producer, and that means they are programming the music, they are behind the mic, they are the mastermind of their own show, and depending on who you have doing that show, that's going to affect the concept of how music is programmed. At Flow, I was constantly in battle with the then program director, Michelle Price, who thought smooth jazz, and I'm sorry, I don't mean jazz has splintered into many offshoots, but what I'd like to say about elevator music, it should remain on the elevator, and jazz is an improvised music, and if you're going to have a radio show, it should reflect that. And so that was really my major conflict at Flow. Whereas they are a station that is, servicing hip hop, R&B, hopefully one day reggae, and so jazz isn't serviced in that way. Jazz has new product. There is real music, real improvised music that is released, that is new, that can be serviced in an industrial context if that's what you want to do, and you don't have to bastardize the music. You don't have to present it in a pop context. I've looked at smooth jazz playlists from the States, and I've seen Eric Clapton's Tears from Heaven on this, and I just thought, I took this to my music director, who was Farley Flex at the time, and I just said, yo, what is up with this? This is not what I want to reflect the show. I have to say that the specialty programmers at Flow, we all had a lot more control over what we played, and I just consider it a fluke and a blessing and a gift that I was able to have control over the playlist for as long as I had.
You had control over your playlist. You
most
selected
of the time, not all of the time, okay. Most of the time.
What you were saying, you were referring to the fact that people like, for instance, Eric Clapton music was being
not being played on Epistrophe, but when I sat down with the
other smooth jazz stations,
yeah,
and you're saying that you don't think that it fit into the format of jazz.
No, it doesn't.
Well, I would
Eric
think that
Clapton's great, but let's put him where he should be.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Sometimes we tend to go a little bit too much off, so to speak. There are people who, as a matter of fact, I've been looking at a number of CDs that they have been putting out, and when you look at some of the artists on it and the title of the tracks, you wonder if really this is smooth jazz. But maybe some people didn't get the grasp the concept of what jazz is. And
well, you see, the thing, as I said, and it's my aesthetic and my opinion that smooth jazz is really instrumental R&B. There's melodic embellishment. There is no blowing over changes the way, Bird would take a solo and blow over some changes. That's not, and I'll use the example of Grover Washington, who actually was a fine horn player and could blow over changes. He made a conscious choice to go in a certain direction for commercial success. I think these radio stations call this instrumental R&B music smooth jazz because jazz has a connotation of hipness and this and that. So I find that people want to use the word jazz, but they don't really want to deal with it. They want to use its hipness. They want to use its glory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tend to agree with you somewhat, but you know what? I'd like to hear from Mr. Smith, Professor Smith, on his take on how he see jazz and what it should be like, or the format that it should take for radio per se.
Well, I think it's a very broad issue, and I think Sharon certainly raises some very important points. For many years, I hosted a program on CKLN that tended to go the other end of the spectrum. While I attempted to historicize and to pay tribute to the range and the history of the music, my focus was what would normally be thought of the avant-garde, the music that started to grow from pretty much the late 1950s up through the present period, and I focused a lot on very experimental, very distant, very complex musics, but not to the extent that I privileged the aesthetics of that music over the larger tradition. Now, the area that I never had a lot of time for certainly is the area that has been under discussion. This notion of smooth jazz, which to me is an oxymoron. And for the most part, as Sharon says, the label has been appended primarily because it's a producer's notion of hipness and a marketing tool. But I'm not also conservative enough to, completely shove it out the door. I think all forms of music have their particular place. I think what's important, though, is that we start to think a little bit about programming in terms of a larger, more discursive process, something that opens forms of dialogue, that opens forms of context. And one of the things that is a little bit problematic, certainly when we look at jazz programming on radio, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in the United States, is that there's very little of it. And one of the things we have to think about, for the most part, is that many things are categorized under this rubric of jazz, but there's very little acknowledgement, perhaps, of what might constitute certain notions of jazz. And yet, of course, I'm also in a very slippery area, because from the very beginning, there have been any number of arguments about what constitutes jazz. Many of the musics that we now accept under that rubric early on existed in contested ways, in ways that people would often argue for and against them, and that only time has really allowed us to configure them all under this particular mantle. The thing that I'm most disturbed about, though, is that for all of that, many musicians and many very, very important figures are rarely represented in any substantial way on the airwaves. We have only a very, very small part of a music that is extremely large, has become an extremely international and powerful form of expression represented at all, either on our mainstream airwaves, and in some cases, in only small ways, on some of our smaller campus airwaves or community stations, and yet we rely on the community stations and the campus stations to carry the frame and the focus of that music, because mainstream stations do not. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, has a very small amount of jazz broadcasting for its on-air hours on both its first and second stations. The same thing might be said, obviously, of any number of stations in Canada, and you've been here for a few years, as you've said. One of the things that changed the jazz broadcasting landscape in the last few years was the Canadian government's deregulation of many of the sort of broadcasting restrictions, so that it meant that where at one time radio stations felt obligated because they had to program particular forms of music, they quickly divested themselves of the jazz obligation when the government said they could. And part of the reason why is because many felt it's not a commercial product. It doesn't bring in the huge corporate advertising that mainstream radio runs on. And for them, if they can't have that particular complement, then the music itself disappears as anything that's necessary.
Well, I tend to agree
hear.
with you when you say that it is not a big spinner, a big seller for them, because they think that a lot of people out there aren't really buying jazz. But there's something interesting that you said, that when you're doing a program, as a host, a presenter perspective, I think that you should be able to know something about the artist and talk about the artist, which is what I try to do when I'm doing my programs, and in as much time that I might have, because, as you know, time is a essence on radio. Before you know it, your program might be off, because you might just have 2 hours, as opposed to a person, or like in CBC, where they have a continuous, flow. Every day they're coming in, and so they could spend more time, talking about an artist. But then there's a certain amount of a time frame that could be spent, because, as you would know, driving or sometimes just listening to the radio, most people want to hear music. And if you find that people are talking a little bit too much, they tend to go to the next dial, which is something you don't want to happen. So I think that when you're talking, you should be able to mix the talk with the music sufficiently and interestingly enough to keep the listener glued to what it is you're talking about. For instance, if you're talking about a musician here like Sean McLeod, and she's performing with, let's just say, Oscar Peterson and somebody else, and you want to set up the track, you should know how much to say, and what you should do in order to keep the listening audience as tight as you can.
True, but I think there's a subjectivity around the notion of listening as well. There are, I think, programming directives, certainly on some of the commercially driven stations, that will elide or erase any kind of contextualization of the artist or the music. You're not allowed to describe or set up or list artists, because you have to leave that time for commercial space.
Right.
Now, the other issue is there are also musicians who will quite often be distracted and worried by too much patter and chatter in terms of the simultaneous playing of the music and sort of the delivering of commentary at the same time. The other side, though, about jazz, which is very important, is that jazz is a player's music. It is an artist's music in the sense that, because so much, as Sharon has alluded to, and we're not going to stereotype the notion of improvisation or instant composition, but each player in jazz becomes his own academy. There is an aspect in the music which is pedagogical, which is sort of trying to teach, to convey information, to do many different things, but it also requires a space that's necessary. It requires certain forms of observance, of silence, of deeper listening. And because jazz does inhabit an area of art music, it requires as well the same focus and concentration that we would give to other areas of art music. So, for instance, when we talk about even patter between the music, if you're listening to European concert programming on the radio, there is no patter involved in the middle of programming that music, but there is an extraordinary amount of setting the table that happens previous to programming and extraing the particular piece that you might be playing. You might be playing a symphony that, if you're playing the entire symphony, might run for an hour and a half. And you're not going to interrupt it. Or you might play a movement from it that runs for half an hour. You're not going to interrupt it. You will set it up. You will extra it. You will give it a certain amount of respect. Mm-hmm. And I think for jazz program, we have to understand that many times this is necessary.
Well, you have to do it. And if you're doing proper radio broadcasting, you have to do it. You have to intro and extra. That's Mr. Bailey has a point that he would like
also
to
too,
make.
I think the industry itself has done a really bad disservice to the community and to people in general out there. And what they're telling you, what is jazz, is not jazz. Talking about Kenny G and this and that, and Peabo Bryson.
There are various forms of jazz, so you have to sort of explain the concept of what is straight ahead jazz.
But the thing is, the thing is, they're trying to sell a bill of goods to people out there, which is rhythm and blues. okay? Or I want to call it adult contemporary music.
Yeah.
But it has nothing to do with jazz.
Okay.
And
It's a spin-off of jazz.
No, it's no. Wait a minute now. Wait a minute. The music. The music is improvisation. The music is improvised. Okay? Rhythm and blues is rhythm and blues.
Okay.
And let's